7 days. That was how long a woman would disappear from her own home, from her own family, from her own life. Not because of serious illness, not because of a crime committed, simply for bleeding. In the biblical world, menstruation transformed women into exiles within their own community, and the conditions they faced were more brutal than anyone imagines today. Leviticus chapter 15 established the rules. Verse 19 was direct and unforgiving. When a woman has her flow of blood, she shall be impure for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. It seems simple, reading it now, but put this into the daily practice of an Israelite village 3,000 years ago. Every accidental touch became contamination. Every shared object became a ritual problem. Every hug with small children was forbidden. The menstruating woman did not simply rest. She was removed, literally taken from the family space and placed in a separate structure, usually a small hut built at the edges of the camp or village. Archaeological records found at ancient Israelite sites show these constructions. Simple structures, sometimes just improvised tents, where women spent nearly a quarter of each month completely isolated from social life. Try to measure the psychological weight of this. A married woman with small children would wake up with bleeding and know exactly what was coming. 7 days away from children who still needed her. 7 days unable to prepare food for the family. 7 days sleeping alone on a cold mat while hearing from a distance the sounds of domestic life continuing without her. And it was not just physical separation. It was contamination in a chain. Verse 20 of Leviticus 15 made it clear. Everything she lies on during her impurity shall be unclean. Everything she sits on shall be unclean. This meant that the isolation hut needed to have its own utensils, its own mat, its own vessels, its own cloths. Nothing she touched could return to common family use without going through purification rituals. The logistics were devastating. Imagine a poor family that barely had resources for a decent tent, needing to maintain a separate structure and duplicate utensils just to accommodate the wife's menstrual cycle. The daughters-in-laws. The material cost of impurity fell upon families already living at the edge of subsistence. But the emotional cost was even worse. Girls learned from their first menstruation that their bodies were a source of contamination. It was not taught as a natural biological event. It was presented as impurity that needed to be contained, isolated, ritually purified. Each month, the message was repeated. You are dirty. You contaminate. You need to stay away. Leviticus chapter 15 verses 19 through 24 describes the consequences of contact. Anyone who touched the menstruating woman became impure until evening and needed to wash their clothes and bathe their body in water. But that was the minimum. If a man had relations with her during the period, his impurity lasted 7 full days, and every bed he lay on became contaminated as well. In practice, this meant that husbands maintained absolute distance, not just physical distance in the intimate sense, complete distance. Many would not even speak directly to their wives during those days, fearing that any proximity might lead to accidental touch. The woman became invisible within her own marriage for almost a week each month. Consider the brutal calculation of this reality. A woman menstruated approximately 12 times per year, 7 days of isolation per cycle. That amounts to 84 days annually, almost 3 months of each year lived in ritualistic exclusion. Over a reproductive life of 30 to 35 years, an Israelite woman spent about 7 to 8 years in a state of menstrual impurity. Years of forced solitude, family separation, and institutionalized shame added together. And menstruation was only the beginning. Childbirth brought even more severe isolation. Leviticus chapter 12 specified that the woman who gave birth to a boy would be impure for 7 days, and then another 33 days in blood purification. a total of 40 days. For a girl, the period doubled, 14 days of initial impurity and 66 days of purification. 80 days in total, almost 3 months away after giving birth to a daughter. The ritual justification was complex, involving concepts of life, death, and blood that permeated the entire Israelite worldview. But the practical application was simple and cruel. Women paid with isolation for each biological function their bodies performed: menstruating, giving birth, breastfeeding after childbirth. Each stage came accompanied by rules that removed them from normal social life. And how did these women deal with the bleeding itself? This part is rarely discussed, but it was brutal. There were no sanitary pads. There was no processed cotton. There were no disposable absorbent materials. What existed were cloths, old rags, scraps of worn fabric, pieces of linen that were no longer useful for anything else. These cloths were folded and placed between the legs, secured somehow to the waist or thighs. They needed to be changed multiple times a day, and afterward they needed to be washed or discarded. Leviticus does not specify what to do with these materials, but the logic of the purity system suggests they were considered highly contaminated, probably burned or buried far from the camp. Access to water was another devastating problem. In the arid regions of ancient Israel, water was too precious a resource to be used abundantly for personal hygiene. A menstruating woman in the isolation hut did not have a bathroom with running water. She did not have a shower. She had, at most, a vessel with limited water for basic cleaning. This meant that hygiene during the period was precarious at best. The desert heat, combined with blood and sweat and lack of adequate cleaning, created a perfect environment for infections. There is no specific historical record of how many women developed health problems from these conditions, but modern medical logic suggests that urinary, vaginal, and dermatological infections must have been extremely common, and the woman suffered in silence. Talking about menstruation was an absolute taboo. The subject was treated with euphemisms. The expression, "the way of women," in Genesis chapter 31 verse 35, was one of the ways to refer to the period without naming it directly. Rachel used this expression to justify why she could not stand up. She told her father that the way of women was upon her. She was menstruating, but she could not pronounce the word. This forced silence amplified the suffering. Menstrual pain, which we now know to be common and sometimes severe, could not be discussed openly. Intense cramps were endured in silence in the isolation hut. There was no medicine, there was no expressed compassion, there was no recognition that the physical pain was real. Just the expectation that the woman would disappear for a week and return ready to resume her duties. The return was not simple either. When the 7 days ended, the woman could not simply go back home and continue life. She needed to go through a purification ritual. Leviticus chapter 15, verses 28 through 30, describe the process. After the 7 days, she would count 7 more days, and then she would be purified. But if the flow continued beyond the normal period, the impurity continued as long as the bleeding lasted, and 7 more days after. And there was the mandatory sacrifice. Verses 29 and 30 specify that on the 8th day, she would take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the door of the tent of meeting. The priest would offer one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, and he would make atonement for her before the Lord for the flow of her impurity. 2 doves. It seems little. But for poor families, 2 birds represented significant value. Did this need to be offered every month? The text is not completely clear. Some scholars argue that the sacrifice was required only in cases of abnormal or prolonged flow. Others maintain that any menstrual period technically required formal purification. Either way, the system placed financial cost on an inevitable biological event. Women did not choose to menstruate. They could not control when or how much they bled, but they had to pay, literally and figuratively, for each cycle. And there were even more tragic cases. Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34 tells the story of a woman who had been bleeding for 12 consecutive years. 12 years of continuous flow. By the law of Leviticus, this meant 12 years in a permanent state of impurity, 12 years unable to touch anyone, 12 years being avoided by everyone, 12 years sleeping alone, eating alone, existing alone. The biblical text adds devastating details. She had spent all she had on doctors and had not improved, but rather grew worse. She spent all her wealth trying to cure herself, not only for physical health, but probably out of desperation to escape the state of perpetual exclusion. A woman who does not stop bleeding is a woman who never comes home, never hugs her children, never sleeps beside her husband, never participates in religious festivals, is never seen as clean. 12 years in this condition meant complete social death, even while being biologically alive. And there was also the matter of marriage. A man who discovered that his bride was menstruating on the wedding night faced a serious dilemma. Relations during the period resulted in 7 days of impurity for him. In addition to making the marriage bed contaminated, many marriages were strategically planned considering menstrual cycles. The bride needed to be clean to consummate the union without bringing impurity upon the husband. But cycles are not perfectly predictable. Stress, change of environment, wedding anxiety. All these factors can alter the timing of menstruation. A bride who menstruated unexpectedly on the eve of the wedding brought shame upon herself and ritual complication upon the entire ceremony. The book of Ezekiel, chapter 18, verse 6, lists relations with a menstruating woman among the grave sins. The righteous. Man does not approach a menstruating woman. It was in the same category as idolatry and injustice against one's neighbor. This shows how the purity system had elevated menstrual separation to a fundamental moral commandment, not merely a ritual rule. And women internalized this view, generations growing up hearing that their bodies, in their natural state, were a source of impurity, that the blood that made life possible was paradoxically contaminating, that monthly they needed to disappear so as not to defile the people they loved. The psychological weight of this message, repeated for decades, is difficult to calculate. But historians and gender scholars point out that menstrual impurity systems, present in various ancient cultures, contributed to positioning women as inherently inferior, biologically problematic, and ritually dangerous. And there were class differences that made everything even more unequal. Rich women could have more comfortable isolation huts, better mats, more water available, slaves who attended to their needs during the period. Poor women faced the same impurity with minimal resources. The same law applied to all produced radically different suffering depending on economic status. A peasant woman who was menstruating still needed to ensure that the animals were fed, that the children did not starve, that essential work continued. But she could not do any of this personally without contaminating everything she touched. The solution was to depend on other family members, usually other women who were not menstruating at the same time. When several women in a family synchronized cycles, a situation that happens naturally when women live together, the logistics became almost impossible. And the system made no exceptions. It did not matter if you were a mother of a baby who was still breastfeeding. It did not matter if you were a widow with no one to help. It did not matter if you were sick with another condition besides menstruation. The impurity was absolute, the isolation was mandatory, the consequences of violating it were severe. Numbers chapter 5 verses 1 through 4 ordered that all impure people be sent outside the camp, so that they may not defile the camp in the midst of which I dwell. The presence of God in the tabernacle was justification for rigorous exclusion of anyone in a state of impurity, and menstruating women automatically entered this category once a month. Scholars debate whether this exclusion was applied literally in all cases, or whether there were degrees of separation. It probably varied according to historical period and region, but the principle was established in the law. Ritual impurity required physical distance from the community. When Israel settled in permanent cities, the system adapted. Isolation huts in villages gave way to separate rooms in larger houses. But the principle continued. The menstruating woman remained apart. She did not participate in family meals. She did not sleep in the conjugal room. She did not touch common utensils. Even the synagogue, when it emerged centuries later, reflected these separations. Women were positioned in separate areas, behind partitions or in elevated balconies, partly to avoid any possibility of contact with men during periods of impurity. Religious architecture was shaped by the menstrual purity code, and there were consequences for those who defied the system. Leviticus chapter 20 verse 18 declared that if a man lay with a woman during her sickness and uncovered her nakedness, he has uncovered her fountain, and she has uncovered the fountain of her blood. Both of them shall be cut off from among their people. Cut off. The Hebrew word karath means to cut, to extirpate. Scholars debate whether it meant the death penalty or permanent exclusion from the community. Either way, a severe consequence. This placed additional vigilance upon women. They needed to carefully monitor their cycles and ensure complete separation during the days of impurity. One mistake, one accidental touch with the husband, one failure to isolate adequately, and the consequences could be permanent. The midwives had knowledge about cycles and purity that was essential for navigating this system. They knew how to identify when the flow was normal menstruation, when it was abnormal bleeding that required different treatment, when the woman was entering the fertile period after purification. This female knowledge passed between generations of women, kept in silence, shared only among them. And even so, accidents happened. Menstrual bleeding does not announce its arrival with precise advance notice. A woman could unexpectedly stain her clothes, could wake up with blood on her mat, could be preparing a meal when the flow started. In these moments, everything she had touched needed to be purified or discarded. The material cost of these accidents was significant. Fabric was expensive and laborious to produce. A stained mat represented real loss. Contaminated utensils needed purification rituals. Menstrual blood had a literal price, beyond the figurative one. And blood was central to all Israelite theology. Leviticus chapter 17 verse 11 declared that the life of the flesh is in the blood. Blood was sacred precisely because it represented life. The same blood that made sacrifices effective was what made menstruation impure. The paradox was embedded in the system. Blood was life. Blood was contamination. It depended on which blood, in which context, coming from which body. Menstrual blood was blood without life. It was the blood that indicated that life had not been generated in that cycle. It was, symbolically, death expelled from the body. And death was absolute impurity in the Levitical system. Contact with a corpse, for example, produced impurity even more severe than menstruation. Menstrual blood carried symbolic association with this cycle of unrealized life. But this sophisticated theological explanation did not soften the practical experience of women living under the system. They did not spend 7 days in isolation contemplating symbolisms of life and death. They spent 7 days alone, uncomfortable, bleeding without adequate resources, waiting for time to pass so they could return to social existence. The prophet Isaiah used menstruation as a metaphor for spiritual impurity. Chapter 64 verse 6 says that all our righteousnesses are like filthy rags. The Hebrew expression is begged idim, literally a menstrual cloth. Even the best thing humans could offer was compared to the most contaminated item the culture knew. The image shows how deeply menstrual impurity was ingrained in the collective consciousness, and generations of women heard this metaphor. They heard their biological experiences being used as the ultimate symbol of impurity and inadequacy. The message was clear even when it was not directed at them. The worst thing that exists is what comes out of you monthly. Some women developed survival strategies within the system, synchronizing cycles with other women in the household so they could keep each other company during isolation, preparing food in advance that would last 7 days so they would not depend so much on others, creating non-verbal communication systems to ask for things without requiring proximity. Mothers taught daughters before their first menstruation. They prepared them for what was to come. They explained the rules, showed where the hut was, demonstrated how to use the cloths, detailed what they could and could not do. These conversations were probably the only moments when the subject was discussed directly, and they came laden with anticipated shame. Imagine a 12 or 13-year-old girl hearing for the first time that soon her body would begin to do something that would make her impure. That because of something she could not control, she would need to separate herself from everyone she loved regularly for the rest of her life. That her body, from that moment on, would carry intrinsic contamination, and the first menstruation would come, the blood would appear, and the girl would be taken to the hut, alone for the first time truly, scared probably. In pain frequently, confused about what was happening to her own body, and completely isolated from any family comfort while going through it. This was the initiation. This was the rite of passage to adult female life in Israel. Not celebration, not festivity, isolation, shame and blood. And the cycle would repeat, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. A woman who lived to 50 and began menstruating at 13 would have gone through approximately 440 menstrual cycles, 440 times removed from family, 440 weeks sleeping alone. Adding it all up, more than 8 years of an entire lifetime spent in menstrual isolation. Some women reached menopause with unconfessable relief. Finally, the bleeding stopped. Finally, they could exist continuously, without monthly forced interruptions. Finally, they were considered permanently pure. But this liberation came at the end of reproductive life, when many had already lost decades under the weight of the system. And there were women who never experienced this liberation. Medical conditions that today would be diagnosed as endometriosis, uterine fibroids, or hormonal disorders caused prolonged or irregular bleeding. These women lived in almost constant impurity. They were the most marginalized among the marginalized, permanently excluded by something they could not control. Ancient doctors attempted treatments, herbs, poultices, prayers, various rituals. The text in Mark about the woman with the flow of blood mentions that she had suffered much at the hands of many physicians. The Greek word for suffer in this context suggests not only the ineffectiveness of treatments, but additional pain caused by them. Treatments that did not cure and still caused harm. Some women resorted to practices considered forbidden: amulets, spells, consultations with pagan healers. The desperation for a cure led to paths that the law condemned, and if they were discovered, they faced double condemnation, impure from the bleeding and guilty for seeking help from forbidden sources. The female body was territory of constant regulation, not only during menstruation, but also in the post-menstrual period. Leviticus chapter 15 verse 18 dealt with relations after the period. If a man lay with a woman and there was an emission of semen, both would bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Even relations during the permitted period brought temporary impurity. This meant that the window of relations without any resulting impurity was extremely narrow. 7 days of Menstrual impurity. 7 additional days of purification. Relations after that brought 1 day of impurity. The system seemed designed to make every aspect of female reproductive life surrounded by regulations and consequences. And there was still the matter of unborn daughters. The longer impurity after the birth of a girl was interpreted in various ways by commentators. Some argued it was because the daughter would also menstruate one day, carrying future impurity in her own body. Others saw simply a difference in value between sons and daughters reflected in the purification time. Either way, to be born female meant bringing 80 days of impurity upon the mother instead of 40. From the first moment of existence, the female body was associated with greater contamination, and women who could not have children faced an additional layer of suffering. Infertility was seen as a curse or divine punishment. Hannah, mother of Samuel, prayed in agony in the temple for a son. Rachel declared she would die if she did not have children. Barrenness was public shame, but at least infertile women did not go through the impurities of childbirth, small consolation for much greater pain. The flow of blood connected fertility and impurity inseparably. The same body that could generate life was the body that monthly demonstrated it had not generated it, and each demonstration required exile. Each biological reminder of unrealized fertility came accompanied by social punishment. Modern scholars try to reconstruct how the women of antiquity themselves understood this system. We do not have writings from ordinary Israelite women about their experiences. What we have are laws written by men, interpreted by men, applied by men. Female voices were silenced by history, but we can infer some things from indirect clues. The fact that Rachel used menstruation as an excuse not to stand up, mentioned in Genesis 31, suggests that women found small ways to use the system to their advantage when possible. The impurity that usually harmed them could occasionally serve as protection or justification. And there was female solidarity. Women caring for other women during periods of isolation, bringing food, bringing water, offering company from a distance. Support networks that functioned at the margins of the official system. Survival through connection even when the law demanded separation. The purity system of Leviticus was not created out of cruelty. It was part of an ancient sanitary code that, with the limited knowledge of the time, tried to protect the community from contaminations, but the practical burden fell almost exclusively on women. Today, archaeologists find remains of the isolation huts. Historians reconstruct the purification rituals, and scholars debate the original intentions behind the laws. What remains undeniable is the human cost. Millions of women, over centuries, lived a reality that combined physical pain with social exclusion. Menstruation, an inevitable biological event, became a monthly burden of institutionalized shame. And this history, however uncomfortable it may be, deserves to be told.